even reading some of the things that you put on your website and that you've said are just such a perfect fit for this podcast. But let's start with your 9-year-old self. Your 9-year-old self had her world turned completely upside down by war. So talk a little bit about your childhood.
Unfortunately, when I was 9, the war erupted in former Yugoslavia, and many of you may have heard of it. It broke the country into various different little countries, and I ended up in a refugee camp, and my father was in a concentration camp. And it was, at the time, I look back, it was the only reality that we had. So there was no poor me. There was no moment of feeling sorry for oneself. I didn't know any different. So I knew hunger, I knew poverty, and I knew that I had to survive. And I really, interestingly, I don't often talk about it. I have my PR team and my marketing just like, we need to tell your story because it's so powerful. But I always resisted being seen as a child who was as a victim, if that makes any sense. But I do understand now. And I think especially, after reading much about you, how important it is to tell the story and communicate that, was that it formed me in myriads of ways. That for 5 years, I lived in this constant state of fear, of grenades falling, of snipers on every roof, of really being hungry, and not just I'm hungry, but truly not having anything to eat or clean water. And sometimes feeling like I just didn't know if I was going to survive the next day. And I think it relates so much about what we're talking about today with the pandemic, with the war in the Ukraine. And I look back and now I understand how it all makes sense. And I am such a big believer that I think it was precisely the path that I had to go through to be of service of humanity. Because until probably 5 years ago, my whole life was about making it, surviving, rebuilding, and then something happens. Like, now what? How do I play a bigger role? What happens now in my life? How do I be of service? So I think that even though it sounds really, really horrid, I'm such a big believer that I was meant to go through that experience.
It's really powerful because, folks complain about a flat tire or, oh, my life is so hard, I broke a nail. I mean, I think after the pandemic, perhaps we have a little bit more perspective than that being a hard day. But, it's been a while for some folks, and they're kind of back to that mentality of like what hard or what difficult looks like, or gosh, my kid got cut from from their team. That's so hard for them. No, you were living in a refugee camp as a child, not knowing if you were going to survive without parents. Was that right? You were there by yourself? Did you have any family with you?
No, for the first 3 months, no, because I was at my uncle's house, and there was bombing started. There was the news that they're going to go through a town and just capture everything. So I was about 40 minutes away from my house, and my uncle just put me in the car and said, "We're fleeing." It was expected that my mom, now my dad was already taken and captured and put in a concentration camp, that my mom and my siblings would join us. So for a very long time, I was by myself, really, with family, with relatives, but it felt so lonely. There were moments where I remember, this is a racket that I created, laying on the floor and feeling all the other parents had their little ones, hugging them and keeping them safe. And I felt so alone because there was no one there to hug me. And I was fed, I was covered, I was taken care of by my relatives. But as a child's mind, there's just the moment of feeling completely unloved. Like, why am I not worthy of safety and that love, which is ridiculous. But I ran that racket for a very long time, Kristi.
It makes sense. I mean, it's the mind of a child going through trauma, not knowing what tomorrow will bring. And I think for many people who can't relate to that specific experience now have a visual, because what's happening in the Ukraine and some of the video that came out, especially right when it started, and the mothers with the children, that was sort of everywhere. So when I think about what that must have been like for you, my mind goes to what I've seen lately with families living in protected areas as they've heard the bombs and been really afraid, not knowing what tomorrow brings. Is what we're seeing on the news now, does that trigger what happened to you? Is that a similar, is that so different?
No, it is so similar. I'm glad you said that. It was very triggering for me because the images were so identical of the images. Not only it seems like Ukrainians and Bosnians are different people, different country, but yet it just seemed walking people without shoes or clothing and running away. Like that is precisely what happened. And it was very difficult to watch for me, those images. And I knew that was my trigger. So I let myself cry and process because body keeps the score. I'm fully aware of what I have gone through, and I'm fully aware how it has affected my entire family profoundly. No one wishes that on anyone. And then I had to sit down with my children who are living in such a wonderful, incredible environment and tell them why mommy was crying and explain that, I'm crying, but I'm okay. And I'm really crying because I'm mostly grateful that we are safe. So my first reaction when the war happened, and I recently spoke about this at WCCO, was that I'm grateful. And it was such an unnatural reaction for me because most of the time it would be so afraid. So Kristi, that's when I knew that I flipped my script. Like my body reacted in a very different way for the very first time. So that's growth. But it is, I have such compassion for what's happening right now in the world. It's very difficult, and there are children right now who are 9-year-old girls and boys who are feeling the same way that I did.
You mentioned a book, which I'm just about finished listening to. The Body Holds a Score. Body Keeps a Score. Anyway, it's an incredible book, but it's really about how you know that you're on the other side of trauma. Not that it ever leaves you, but that you can have a different perspective, a more healthy perspective, when you can look at it and say, that's something that happened to me, as opposed to getting right back in the trauma and not being able to get out of that. So what you're saying for people that haven't read the book is that you knew that you had some kind of profound healing that has happened since that time, because you could watch what was happening in the Ukraine and be sad and realize that that happened to you, but be on the other side of that, as opposed to being in it and somehow, mentally, physically spiraling. Is that fair?
Oh, that is such a beautiful summary. True, but interestingly, I'm glad that you're reading that book. When I read it 4 years ago, when after 20 years I went back to Bosnia, my dad was dying from cancer, and my children were very little, and it was the first time. I mean, after 20 years, and I walked into my hometown thinking, I am at the height of my career, I have my children, I'm happily married, I am such a happy-go-lucky, look at me, I'm so excited. And the moment I walked back into my house, I started hyperventilating. And I started just getting really hot, really angry, and then I lost my breath. And my husband was looking at me, he's like, what is happening? I'm like, I have no idea. And it was such an unnatural reaction. I have never in my life, even after all of this, I've never seen a therapist. I've never really sought mental health therapy or trauma therapy. I had to flee my town because I felt like I was crazy in the most simplified way. And I was then told that I was experiencing a delayed onset of PTSD because after the war had ended, there was no time to lick our wounds, right? Everyone was there who has been through war. Everyone has suffered. So I just had to look forward, like what was the next day? And then I got a scholarship to the United States. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is the greatest country in the world. Like, I had to get educated. And look at it, I'm a woman and I have rights here. And oh my goodness, I can go to school and library is free. I can read as many books as I want. And it just became this never-ending cookie jar. And it was so delightful to do all of this. I never really looked back, but the body does keep the score. So for me, it was after almost 4 decades or 3 decades rather, that I just broke down completely. And I think I did so much healing 4 years ago because I had to stop whatever I was doing and then shift that trajectory, which was really, really powerful. And I think that right now, interestingly, I'm writing a book, and in terms of how we're being affected by the pandemic. So people look at me and say, well, I should not be unhappy. Look at what you've gone through. But I really do believe that everything is relative. So looking at it this way, not minimizing anyone's pain or what people are going through, and taking that, whatever we have gone through, and really processing it, because if we don't, we're in big, big trouble later on.